Salem should not be charming, it is. The brick storefronts lean into the mythology. Black cats in the windows, cauldrons on the signs, tour groups drifting through October fog as though the whole thing were staged. It is partly staged, but there is a place the staging does not reach. Archaeologists confirmed its location in 2016. Proctor's Ledge, on the city's western edge, unremarkable, wooded, absent from most maps. This is where the hangings actually happened. A memorial stands there now, 19 names carved in stone. Salem waited 300 years to place them. The question is not what the delay cost. The question is what it protected. Salem does not announce itself the way haunted places usually do. There is no ruin visible from the road, no collapsed wing, no obvious wound in the landscape. What Salem presents to the arriving visitor is a tidy colonial streetscape, a harbor that catches light cleanly in the morning, shops selling candles shaped like cats, museums staffed by people in cloaks who smile when they take your money. The city has decided what it is. It has made a market of its worst year, dressed the dead in costume, and sold admission to the site of its own crimes. This is not the unusual thing about Salem. The unusual thing is how thoroughly the arrangement has worked. The ground at Proctor's Ledge is unremarkable. A gentle slope at the edge of a residential neighborhood, bordered by a chain-link fence, overlooked by the back windows of ordinary houses. For 300 years, the people of Salem told visitors that the executions had taken place on the hill to the northeast. The hill with the better view, the more dramatic silhouette against the sky. In 2016, archaeological and documentary research confirmed that this was incorrect. The executions happened here, at this ledge, this unremarkable slope. The bodies were left where they fell, in shallow ground, and the families were not permitted to retrieve them. Some accounts suggest that relatives came in the night to carry the dead home in secret. The record does not confirm this. The record, in many places, was never kept. A memorial was erected in 1992. 300 years after the events it commemorates, the city of Salem placed stone benches in a small park, each bench carved with a name and a date of death. The benches are set into a low wall. The names face inward. Visitors walk past them, children climb on them. On the morning of a mild October weekday, a woman photographs herself in front of the carved name of a woman hanged for witchcraft in 1692. Both women are smiling. Salem does not find this troubling. Salem has made its peace with the image it requires. The question Salem has never fully answered is not whether the accused were witches. Everyone agrees they were not. The question is simpler and less comfortable. Who needed them to be? The story Salem tells about itself begins in the winter of 1691 in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, minister of the Salem Village Church. 2 girls fell ill. Betty Parris, 9 years old, daughter of the minister, Abigail Williams, 11, his niece. The illness presented as fits, as contortions, as moments in which the girls cried out that something invisible was tormenting them. A 3rd girl, Ann Putnam Jr., 12 years old, soon exhibited the same symptoms. Then others. The physician who examined Betty could find no natural cause. He suggested the possibility of the evil hand. Reverend Parris accepted this framing. What happened next has been described in the centuries since as mass hysteria, as ergot poisoning, as adolescent rebellion, as genuine religious terror, as community-wide psychosis. All of these explanations share one feature in common. They locate the origin of events in the girls. This is where the official story requires correction. The girls named names, but the names they named were not random, and the pattern of accusation, when mapped against the documented land records of Essex County, does not look like hysteria. It looks like something considerably more deliberate. Thomas Putnam was 40 years old in 1692, a man whose family had occupied a position of prominence in Salem Village for 2 generations. His father had been one of the wealthiest men in the region. By the time of the trials, that wealth had contracted. The estate had been divided among multiple heirs. Disputes over land boundaries and inheritance rights had placed the Putnam family in documented legal conflict with several of their neighbors. The records of Essex County preserve these disputes in detail: contested acreage, unpaid debts, boundary lines that moved in court filings and then moved again. Thomas Putnam did not merely watch the accusations unfold from a distance. He filed more formal complaints against accused individuals than any other single person in Salem village. His wife, Ann Putnam Sr., became one of the primary adult accusers. His daughter, Ann Putnam Jr., was one of the original afflicted girls. The first three people accused were Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Paris household, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who had been reduced to wandering from house to house asking for food, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had stopped attending church and whose estate was the subject of a legal dispute with, the record is clear on this point, the Putnam family. This was not accident. Reverend Samuel Parris had his own reasons. He had come to Salem Village in 1689 under contested circumstances, his salary disputed, his authority resisted by a faction of the congregation that opposed granting him the deed to the parsonage house. The men who led that opposition were Francis Nurse, John Proctor, and Daniel Andrew. Their wives and family members would, within months, appear on the list of the accused. Parris preached the reality of the devil's presence in his congregation from the pulpit, while accusations spread through his own household. He did not remove his daughter from the proceedings. He did not restrain his niece. He testified against members of his congregation in court. His unpaid salary was eventually resolved. The deed to the parsonage was transferred. The record notes this without comment. The geography of accusation in Salem Village has been studied extensively. When researchers have mapped the home lots of accusers against the home lots of the accused, a pattern emerges that is difficult to attribute to theology. The accused tended to live on the eastern side of the village, where the land was more fertile, more connected to the port economy of Salem town, more prosperous. The accusers tended to live on the western side, more isolated, more economically marginal, more reliant on the traditional farming economy that was, by 1692, beginning to lose ground. The line between accuser and accused follows, with uncomfortable regularity, the line between economic decline and economic stability. The court entered no objection to this pattern. The court did not examine it. The court, when it was finally constituted to hear these cases, would prove itself capable of many things. Examination of its own interests was not among them. What the afflicted girls provided, what Thomas Putnam and Samuel Parris and the factional interests of Salem Village required, was a mechanism, a way to move against enemies that the law, as it existed, did not otherwise permit. Accusation of witchcraft was not easily defended against. The accused could not cross-examine a dream. The accused could not call the devil as a witness and demand he account for his appearances. The accused were, by the terms of the proceeding, already presumed to have consented to what they were accused of. The burden moved in one direction only. The girls who began this, whatever was wrong with them, whatever combination of fear and suggestion and coercion and genuine belief produced their testimony, did not design the machine they were placed inside. But the machine was designed. It did not assemble itself out of fear and theology and winter darkness. It was assembled by men with names in the county record, with land disputes in the county record, with financial interests that the county record preserves in careful, unemotional detail. Bridget Bishop was hanged on the 10th of June, 1692. She was the first. The pattern, once visible, cannot be made invisible again. Lay the accusations of 1692 against a map of Salem Village property lines, and what emerges is not the random scatter of collective delusion. It is a directed thing. The accused cluster along specific boundaries. The accusers cluster along others. The overlap between documented land disputes and the names on the warrant lists is not perfect. Nothing in history is. But it is consistent enough that the county records of Essex County function 300 years later as a kind of parallel testimony. The land itself bears witness to what the court would not examine. Thomas Putnam filed formal complaints against at least 21 individuals during the course of the trials. 21. His signature appears on depositions, on warrants, on the supporting documents that the court required before an arrest could be made. He was not a passive observer who watched his daughter suffer and sought explanation. He was an active participant in the legal machinery, and he understood that machinery well. He had used the courts before, in the land disputes that the record preserves in careful, unexcited detail. He knew what documents were required. He knew which magistrates were sympathetic. He knew that an accusation of witchcraft, once formally entered, placed the burden of proof in a location from which it could not easily be moved. His wife, Ann Putnam Sr., did not merely support the accusations, she made them herself. She was one of the adult accusers, a category that is often overlooked in accounts of the trials that prefer to focus on the afflicted girls as the sole engine of the crisis. Ann Putnam Sr. was 30 years old. She was not a child. She was not confused. She accused Rebecca Nurse. She accused Martha Corey. She accused the minister George Burroughs. The three of them would be dead before the year was finished. Her daughter, Ann Putnam Jr., who was 12 years old when the accusations began, would carry what she had witnessed and participated in for the rest of her life. The weight of that is a matter for later. Reverend Samuel Parris stands at the theological center of the machinery, which is to say that he provided the framework within which the machinery could operate. He had come to Salem Village in 1689 after a failed career as a merchant in Barbados, where his business had collapsed and where, some accounts suggest, he had acquired Tituba and her husband John Indian as enslaved persons. He arrived in Salem Village already in conflict with a faction of the congregation over the terms of his employment. His salary, set initially at £66 per year, had gone partially unpaid, and he had demanded, unusually, that the deed to the parsonage house be transferred to him personally rather than remaining the property of the church. This demand was refused by the faction led by Francis Nurse, John Proctor, and Daniel Andrew. These three men and their families would appear on the list of the accused. Parris preached the presence of the devil with increasing urgency in the months before the first accusations, warning his congregation that Satan had established a foothold among them, that the community was under spiritual siege, that treachery lived inside the meeting house itself. When his daughter Betty and his niece Abigail began exhibiting the symptoms that would be attributed to witchcraft, he called in the physician William Griggs, who could find no natural cause, and then he called in other ministers who examined the girls and reached similar conclusions. Parris did not remove his household from the proceedings. He participated in the interrogations, he kept notes, he testified. His salary dispute was resolved during the trials. The record notes this without elaboration. The three women named in the first formal accusations, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, shared a single characteristic that made them ideal candidates for the role they were assigned. They were already outside the circle of community protection. Tituba was enslaved, a status that placed her beyond most of the legal recourse available to free persons. Sarah Good was homeless, a beggar, who wandered between households asking for food and lodging, widely regarded with the combination of pity and contempt that communities reserve for those they have already decided to discard. Sarah Osborne had stopped attending church, which in 1692 Massachusetts was not merely a social failing but a public declaration of separation from the covenant community. She was also elderly, and her estate was the subject of a legal dispute with the Putnam family. Not random, not hysteria, a selection. Tituba's interrogation on the 1st of March, 1692, produced a confession that the court found extraordinary. Under sustained questioning, counts described the interrogation as lasting hours, with the magistrates pressing her repeatedly for details, for names, for confirmation. Tituba provided what was asked of her. She described the devil. She described a book with names in it. She described other witches in the community. She gave the court a framework and a direction and a precedent, and in doing so, she saved her own life. A confessor was not hanged. A confessor was a witness for the prosecution. The colony needed confessors more than it needed another body on the scaffold, and Tituba, who had every reason to understand the terms of survival in a system that had never extended her its protection, understood what was being asked of her and provided it. Sarah Osborne died in prison in May 1692 before she could be brought to trial. She had been held in Boston jail in conditions that the record describes as severe since her arrest in February. She was the first to die. Her death was not an execution. The court entered no record of concern. Sarah Good was hanged on the 19th of July, 1692, one of 5 executed that day. At the gallows, the Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged her to confess. She refused. She said that she was no more a witch than he was a wizard, and that if he took her life, God would give him blood to drink. Noyes died years later of a hemorrhage. The blood ran internally. Salem carries this story the way it carries all its stories. Not as warning, not as vindication, but as fact. cold and without interpretation, set into the record and left there. Bridget Bishop was hanged on the 10th of June, 1692. She was the first. She had been accused of witchcraft once before, in 1680, and acquitted. She kept a tavern. She wore a red bodice at a time when the color was red as evidence of character. She was accused again in 1692 by 5 different complainants, convicted on the testimony of spectral evidence and the claim that her apparition had tormented people in their sleep, and hanged 8 days after her trial concluded. She was approximately 60 years old. The record is not precise about her age. The record was not required to be precise about the ages of those it was destroying. Who needed witches in Salem in 1692? The answer is in the property records. The answer is in the salary disputes. The answer is in the names of the accusers laid against the names of the accused laid against the survey maps of a village dividing itself along lines of land and money and theological authority. The devil was a useful instrument. He required no deed of his own. He left no signature in the county record. He could be deployed against a neighbor, a creditor, a rival, an elderly woman who had stopped coming to church, and when the work was done, he could be withdrawn, and the land would remain, and the debt would be cleared, and the living would continue to hold what the dead no longer could. The court that would make this possible had not yet been formed. That came next. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was created on the 27th of May, 1692, by the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Sir William Phipps. It was not an existing court adapting to unusual circumstances. It was a new instrument, assembled for a specific purpose, staffed by specific men, and granted specific powers that no ordinary court of the colony possessed. The name derives from the Anglo-French legal tradition, Oyer and Terminer, to hear and to determine. The court would hear the witchcraft cases. It would determine their outcomes. It would do both with a speed that the record, 3 centuries later, still registers as a kind of violence. The court's chief judge was William Stoughton, lieutenant governor of the colony, and a man whose theological convictions were indistinguishable from his legal reasoning. He had studied at Oxford. He had returned to Massachusetts, committed to a vision of the Puritan project as a covenant between God and the colony, a covenant that could be broken from within by the presence of the devil's servants among the faithful. Stoughton was not a man susceptible to doubt. The record of his conduct during the trials does not preserve a single moment of hesitation. He pushed the proceedings forward with the consistency of a man who believed the outcome had already been determined by a higher authority than his own. The other judges included Samuel Sewall, a merchant and diarist whose account of the trials has survived in detail; Nathaniel Saltonstall, who resigned from the court after the first execution and never explained his reasons publicly; John Hathorne, an ancestor of the novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose aggressive interrogation style during the pre-trial examinations functioned less as inquiry than as accusation; and Waite Winthrop, whose family name carried the full weight of Massachusetts Puritan authority. These were not marginal men. They were the colony's establishment, its legal and theological center, its keepers of the covenant. They were also men with political debts, land holdings, and positions that depended on the continued authority of the government that had appointed them. The court's fatal innovation was spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was the legal recognition of testimony about dreams and visions as admissible proof of guilt. A witness could testify that the specter, the spiritual form, of an accused person had appeared to them in the night, had pressed upon them, had bitten or choked or tormented them in ways that left no mark on the body, and produced no evidence that any instrument of ordinary law could examine. The accused could not challenge this testimony. They could not produce an alibi for their specter. They could not demonstrate that their spirit had been elsewhere. The logic of the court held that only a witch could send her specter to do harm, and therefore the appearance of a specter was proof of the witch's guilt, a circle sealed from the inside. The colonial ministers, including Increase Mather, the most prominent theologian in Massachusetts, had reservations about spectral evidence from the beginning. Mather argued that the devil might be capable of assuming the shape of an innocent person, which would mean that the appearance of a specter proved nothing about the guilt of the person it resembled. The court was informed of this objection. The court proceeded regardless. Stoughton's position was that the devil could not assume the shape of an innocent person without that person's consent, which meant that any specter was by definition the specter of the guilty. The circular reasoning locked the door from both sides. There was no position from which an accused person could mount a defense. By the end of May, over 100 persons had been formally accused. By the end of June, 19 would be dead or awaiting execution. The acceleration between February and September, 7 months from the first accusation in the Paris household to the last hanging on Gallows Hill, produced a body count and a warrant list that the colony's own documents confirm without editorial comment. The documents do not express alarm. The documents record names, dates, charges, verdicts, sentences. They are written in the careful hand of clerks who were present at proceedings that killed their neighbors and noted the proceedings with the same unvarying penmanship they would have used to record a property transfer. Salem remembers this, though it does not advertise it. The records exist. They are preserved. They have been read by historians and lawyers and descendants of the accused who recognize the names. The records are not disputed. What is disputed, what has never been fully resolved, is the question of what the men who kept those records believed they were doing, whether they genuinely feared the devil's presence in their community, or whether they understood at some level that the machinery they were operating served purposes that had nothing to do with theology. Giles Corey understood something about the machinery. He was a farmer. He was 80 years old in 1692, or near enough. The record is not precise about his birth year. He had lived in Salem for decades. He had a farm. He had a wife, Martha, who had already been accused and arrested. And he had made, at some point before his arrest, a legal decision that the court did not anticipate and could not easily accommodate. He refused to enter a plea. The refusal was not irrational. Under the law of the colony at the time, a person who died before entering a plea could not be convicted of a felony. A person who could not be convicted of a felony could not have their estate attainted, seized by the court as the property of a condemned criminal. Giles Corey had transferred his farm to his two sons-in-law shortly before his arrest. If he died without entering a plea, the transfer would stand. The farm would remain in the family. The court could not touch it. The court's response to his refusal was the application of peine forte et dure, a punishment under English law for those who refused to submit to trial, in which the accused was laid on the ground, a board was placed across their chest, and stones were added to the board one by one until the person either entered a plea or died under the weight. On the 18th of September, 1692, Giles Corey was carried to a field adjacent to the Salem town jail and laid on the ground. The pressing began. The sheriff, according to accounts that the colony's own records do not contradict, used his cane to push Corey's tongue back into his mouth when it protruded under the pressure of the stones. The pressing continued for 2 days. Corey did not enter a plea. On the 19th of September, with more weight upon his chest than his body could sustain, he spoke his last recorded words. More weight. He died on the ground of a field in Salem in September, under stones that the court had placed there, protecting a farm that his family would keep because he had refused to give the institution what it demanded. The institution recorded his death. It entered no objection to the method. Giles Corey died on the 19th of September, 1692. He did not confess. He did not enter a plea. He did not give the court what it required to proceed against him. He lay on the ground of a field in Salem while the stones accumulated on the board across his chest, and he spoke 2 words when the sheriff demanded he submit, and those 2 words were the same words he had spoken the day before and the day before that. More weight. The farm passed to his sons-in-law. The court could not touch it. The institution that had assembled itself to hear and to determine the guilt of witches in Massachusetts Bay had pressed an 80-year-old farmer to death over the course of 3 days. And the thing it was trying to take from him, the land, the property, the estate that represented the accumulated work of a man's entire life, remained beyond its reach. He had understood the machine better than the machine had understood him. He had found the one position from which it could not extract what it wanted. The cost of that position was everything else. The record notes his death in the same careful hand that noted the property transfers and the warrant applications and the testimony of the afflicted girls. The penmanship does not change. The ink does not hesitate. Martha Corey, his wife, was hanged on the same day he died. She had been one of the early accused, arrested in March, held in prison for 6 months while the proceedings ground forward. She was a full member of the Salem Village Church. She had expressed skepticism about the girls' accusations early in the crisis. Accounts describe her as having said that the accusers were telling lies, that the court was being deceived. This skepticism was noted. It was entered into the record. It was used against her. She was hanged on the 19th of September, 1692, on Gallows Hill, along with 3 others. Her husband died that same afternoon in the field beside the jail. The court of Oyer and Terminer continued its work through October. The executions had not slowed the accusations. Over 150 persons were in custody or under formal accusation by the time the court convened its October session. The afflicted girls had named new targets. The circle of accusation had widened beyond Salem village into the surrounding towns, Andover, Gloucester, Ipswich. Andover alone produced over 40 accused persons in a matter of weeks, the accusations spreading through the town with the speed and logic of a document that had already established its own terms of proof and left no mechanism for refutation. It was at this point that the machinery encountered an obstacle it could not press to death. Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps, was named as a suspect. The record does not preserve the precise circumstances of her accusation, whether it came from one of the afflicted girls or from an adult accuser or from some other source. What the record does preserve is the sequence of events that followed. Governor Phipps, who had created the court in May, who had appointed its judges, who had signed the death warrants for the executed, who had sailed to the Maine frontier in August to prosecute a military campaign, and left the court to conduct its work without direct gubernatorial oversight. This same Governor Phipps, upon his return to Boston in October, and his discovery that his wife had been named, wrote to the Crown authorities in London and described the proceedings as having gone beyond their proper bounds. He dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer on the 29th of October, 1692. The court that had operated without interference through 19 hangings, 1 pressing, and the deaths of at least 2 persons in prison custody was ended within days of the governor's wife being accused. The institution did not explain this timing. No official acknowledgement was entered into the record connecting the dissolution of the court to Lady Phipps's accusation. The 2 events are separated in the documents by a matter of weeks and by no stated causal relationship. Salem remembers the sequence, even if the documents decline to name it. A new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was convened in January of 1693 to hear the remaining cases. It did not admit spectral evidence. Without spectral evidence, the cases collapsed. Of the remaining accused, 3 were convicted and sentenced to death. Governor Phipps reprieved all 3. By May of 1693, the last of the accused had been released from custody. The colony declared the matter resolved. No judge of the court of Oyer and Terminer was ever formally censured. No official of the colonial government was held accountable. William Stoughton, the chief judge who had driven the proceedings forward with the consistency of a man who could not imagine himself wrong, continued in public life. He served as acting governor of Massachusetts from 1694 to 1699. He died in 1701, honored and unrebuked, a man of consequence in the colony he had helped to build. Salem does not forget this. Salem keeps it the way it keeps everything. In the ground, in the record, in the names that the documents preserve without apology or explanation. Rebecca Nurse had been a grandmother. This is the public record's description of her, and it is accurate as far as it goes. She was 71 years old in 1692. She was partially deaf. She had been a member of the Salem Village Church for years, and was regarded by her neighbors as a woman of uncommon piety and good character. When she was formally accused in March of 1692, her community responded with something the court had not yet encountered: organized resistance. 39 of her neighbors signed a petition on her behalf. 39 names entered into the record, attesting to her character, her conduct, her standing in the community, the impossibility of the accusations against her. The petition was presented to the court. The court received it. The court entered it into the record alongside the testimony of the afflicted girls, who had claimed that Rebecca Nurse's specter had tormented them in the night, had choked them, had pressed upon them with invisible hands. The jury deliberated. They returned a verdict of not guilty. The afflicted girls responded with fresh convulsions in the courtroom. The noise was immediate and sustained. Judge Stoughton sent the jury back for further deliberation. He indicated, without stating it directly, that the jury had not adequately considered one piece of testimony in which Nurse had made a remark that could be interpreted as a statement of solidarity with another accused person. The jury returned. They changed their verdict. The court found Rebecca Nurse guilty of the crime of witchcraft. She petitioned the governor for a reprieve. Governor Phipps granted it. Then, accounts describe, he was persuaded to withdraw it. The reprieve was rescinded. No formal record explains why. She was excommunicated from the Salem village church on the 12th of July, 1692, in a ceremony conducted by Reverend Paris. The excommunication stripped her of her membership in the covenant community, the community whose protection she had sought, whose petition on her behalf had changed nothing. She was not yet hanged. That was still coming. Rebecca Nurse was hanged on the 19th of July, 1692. Her family came for the body. Accounts describe them retrieving her from the shallow ground where the executed were left on Gallows Hill, carrying her home in the night, burying her on the family property where the ground was hers, by right and by grief. The record does not confirm or deny this. The record was not required to follow the dead once the court had finished with them. Her excommunication was reversed by the Salem village church in 1712, 20 years after the fact. The reversal was entered into the church record without ceremony. The record does not note whether anyone was present who had signed the petition on her behalf in 1692. The record does not note whether Reverend Paris, who had conducted the excommunication, was mentioned in the reversal. Paris had left Salem village by 1712. He had been forced out by the same faction that had opposed him before the trials, the men whose families he had helped to destroy. He died in 1620. The record preserves his death without elaboration. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old. She was partially deaf. She was beloved. The court hanged her anyway, and Salem keeps this fact the way it keeps all its facts, flat, without apology, in the permanent record of what was done here. George Burroughs had been a minister. He had served the Salem village congregation before Samuel Paris, had left under disputed circumstances related to his salary, unpaid like Paris's would later be, a detail the record preserves without apparent awareness of its own irony, and had moved to Maine where he was serving another congregation when the accusation reached him. He was arrested in May of 1692, transported back to Salem, and charged with the crime of being the leader of the witches, the devil's minister in Massachusetts, the man who had recruited the afflicted girls into the devil's service and orchestrated the entire conspiracy from a distance. He was a small man. Accounts describe him as physically slight. Several witnesses testified to his supernatural strength, that he had lifted a heavy gun barrel with one finger, that he had carried a barrel of molasses single-handedly, feats that the accusers presented as evidence of diabolical power rather than ordinary physical capacity. The court received this testimony without objection. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death. On the 19th of August, 1692, he was taken to Gallows Hill along with 4 others, John Proctor, John Willard, Martha Carrier, and George Jacobs Sr. The 5 of them were hanged on the same afternoon, their bodies left where they fell, families refused permission to remove them. The shallow soil of the hill receiving what the court had made of 5 lives. At the foot of the ladder, George Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer, a which, according to the theology that had governed every proceeding of the court of Oyer and Terminer, could not recite the Lord's Prayer. The devil would not permit it. A servant of Satan would stumble over the words, would choke, would lose the thread of the prayer before its completion. This was not a peripheral belief. It was a documented article of the court's operating theology, cited in the proceedings, accepted by the judges, invoked in testimony. The prayer was, in the language of the trials, a test. Burroughs recited it perfectly, every word, without hesitation, without error. The crowd that had gathered to witness the execution fell silent. Accounts describe a visible and immediate change in the assembly, a wavering, a murmur, the particular sound of a crowd that has just encountered something it cannot accommodate within the framework it arrived with. Several witnesses reported that the crowd began to move toward the ladder, that there was a collective sense that the execution could not proceed, that something had just demonstrated itself that the court could not explain away. Cotton Mather was present on horseback. He was the most prominent minister in Massachusetts, the son of Increase Mather, the man whose theological writings had provided much of the intellectual framework for the trials. He rode forward through the crowd and spoke. He reminded the assembly that the devil could assume many shapes, that the appearance of innocence was itself a form of deception, that the court had proceeded by lawful means, and its verdict was not to be overturned by the spectacle of a man on a ladder saying words that could be said by the guilty and the innocent alike. The execution proceeded. George Burroughs was hanged on the 19th of August, 1692, in front of a crowd that had, for a moment, understood something the court refused to acknowledge. Salem remembers the moment. It carries the image of the crowd and the horse and the prayer and the man on the ladder, and it holds all of it together in the same unresolved silence it applies to everything it cannot explain. Tituba survived. She was the first to confess, the first to give the court a narrative it could use, the first to name names and describe the devil's book and provide the framework within which every subsequent accusation would be understood. Her confession in March of 1692 lasted hours. The magistrates pressed her for detail, and she provided it. And the detail she provided, the black dog, the yellow bird, the man in black who came in the night and asked her to sign his book, became the template against which every other confession in the trials was measured. She confessed because she understood what the alternative was. The alternative was what happened to Sarah Good, to Sarah Osborne, to the people who refused to confess. Tituba was enslaved. She had no legal standing, no community petition, no 39 neighbors whose signatures could be entered into the record on her behalf. She had the confession, and the confession kept her alive, and she knew it, and she gave it. She remained in prison for more than a year. When the trials ended and the court was dissolved and the remaining accused were released, Tituba was not simply freed. She could not be freed. She was property, and property had a price. The jail fees that had accumulated during her imprisonment, the cost of her confinement, charged to the prisoner under the colony's law, were owed by the man who owned her. Samuel Parris refused to pay them. Tituba was sold to an unknown purchaser to satisfy the debt. The record does not preserve the purchaser's name. The record does not note where she went. She disappears from the documentary record of Salem in 1693, sold for the cost of the imprisonment that her coerced confession had made necessary. No name was entered for her destination. No record was kept of what followed. There was also a dog. The record preserves this without apparent awareness of what it means. A dog belonging to a Salem village resident was accused of witchcraft in February of 1692, on the testimony of one of the afflicted girls who claimed the dog had bewitched her. The dog was shot. It was the only animal executed during the Salem witch trials. The court entered no objection to the proceeding. The record notes the execution as a matter of course, in the same hand and the same ink as everything else, and moves on. Gallows Hill holds the 5 hanged in August: Burroughs, Proctor, Willard, Carrier, Jacobs. It holds Rebecca Nurse, hanged in July. It holds the bodies of all 19. It holds the infant born to Sarah Good in prison, whose name was never recorded, who died before it could be entered into any document that has survived. It holds the silence of families who could not retrieve their dead. Salem could not explain what had been done here. It still cannot. Proctor's Ledge is not where the tourists go. The tourists go to Gallows Hill, to the park with the playground equipment and the gentle slope and the view of the surrounding neighborhood, a hill that the city of Salem maintained for decades as the probable site of the executions, while the evidence for that identification was, at best, circumstantial. In 2016, a team of researchers from the University of Virginia, working with documentary records, property maps, and site surveys, confirmed what a smaller group of historians had long suspected. The executions had not taken place on the hill. They had taken place at Proctor's Ledge, a rocky outcropping at the base of Gallows Hill, bordered now by a chain-link fence and the backlots of residential houses on Pope Street. The site is unremarkable. The ground is uneven. There is nothing there to indicate what it absorbed. The bodies of 19 people were left in that ground. Families were refused permission to retrieve them. Some came in the night anyway. Accounts describe quiet, illicit burials conducted in darkness, families carrying their dead home by lantern light because the alternative was to leave them where the court had placed them. The record does not confirm or deny these nighttime retrievals. The record was not keeping track of the dead once they had served their institutional purpose. Salem remembers Proctor's Ledge now, A small memorial was installed there in 2017, the year after the site was confirmed. It lists the names of the executed on stone markers set into a low wall. The names are there: Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Wilds, George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, George Jacobs Sr., John Proctor, John Willard, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Ann Puditer, Dorcas Hoare, Mary Parker, Wilmot Redd, Margaret Scott, Samuel Wardwell, Martha Corey, 19 names. The memorial in Charter Street, the one erected in 1992, 300 years after the events it commemorates, uses stone benches set into a low wall, each bench carved with a name and a date. The benches face inward. They have been there for more than 30 years. Tourists photograph themselves beside them. The city has integrated the memorial into its October economy, directing visitors toward it as one stop among many on the walking tour of historical Salem. The memorial is real. The grief it represents is real. The 300 years between the deaths and the commemoration are also real, and the city does not advertise that gap with the same energy it applies to the candle shops and the costume rentals. The colony's formal response to what it had done arrived in stages, none of them sufficient. In January of 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and prayer, an acknowledgement that errors had been committed and that God's forgiveness was required. The language of the declaration was theological, not legal. No individual was named as responsible. No judge was censured. The day of fasting was observed, and then the colony moved forward, as colonies do. In 1711, the General Court passed a bill reversing the attainders of the condemned, restoring in legal terms the civil rights of the executed, clearing the convictions from the record. The bill named 22 individuals. It also authorized compensation payments to the surviving families. The amounts were specified in the legislation. The estate of John Proctor received £158 and 12 shillings. The estate of George Burroughs received £50. The estate of Giles Corey, the man pressed to death under stones over the course of 3 days, received £21. Rebecca Nurse's family received £25. These were the amounts the colony of Massachusetts assigned to the lives it had taken. The record preserves them. The record does not comment on their adequacy. Thomas Putnam was dead by 1711. He had died in 1705, the same year as his wife, Ann Putnam Sr. He did not live to see the attainders reversed. He did not appear before any court to account for the 21 complaints he had filed, for the names he had placed on the warrant lists, for the land disputes that the county record preserves alongside the death warrants his accusations helped to produce. No proceeding was ever convened to examine his role. No record was required of him that he did not wish to give. His daughter, Ann Putnam Jr., gave the only public apology the Salem trials ever produced. In 1706, 14 years after the accusations, she stood before the congregation of the Salem Village Church, the same church in which her father had sat while Reverend Parris preached the devil's presence among the faithful. And a statement was read on her behalf. She was ill, accounts say, and could not read it herself. She stood with her head bowed while the minister read her words to the congregation. The statement said that she had been a chief instrument of accusing several persons of a grievous crime, whereby their lives were taken away from them. It said that she had done it ignorantly, being deluded by Satan. It asked forgiveness of God and of all those she had given just cause of sorrow and offense. She did not name her father. She did not name Reverend Parris, who had died the year before. She did not name the men whose property disputes had mapped the accusations onto specific families and specific parcels of land in Essex County. She said she had been deluded. She asked forgiveness from the living and the dead alike. The congregation received her statement. The record preserves it. It is the only public apology in the documentary record of the Salem witch trials, and it is the apology of a woman who was 12 years old when the accusations began, delivered in a church built on the same ground as the silence that made everything possible. Stand at Proctor's ledge, read the names on the wall, count them. 19 hanged, 1 pressed, 2 dead in prison, at least 1 infant whose name was never recorded. Consider the ground beneath your feet, what it received in 1692, what was left there, what the city built over it and around it and told visitors to look at elsewhere for 300 years. The haunting of Salem is not the ghost stories, it is not the women in cloaks, the guided tours, the museums with their period costumes and their careful language about a community under stress. The haunting is this: a legal system was assembled from existing institutions and existing men and existing laws, and it killed people, and it was stopped not by justice but by the proximity of the governor's wife to the machinery, and the men who built and operated that machinery were never held to account, and the amounts paid to the families of the dead were entered into the legislative record, and the legislature moved on. Salem was not an aberration, it was a demonstration. It showed what institutions do when fear is available as currency. They spend it on the people who cannot refuse the transaction, and they protect the ledger, and when it is over, they issue a day of fasting and restore the civil rights of the dead, and they build a memorial 300 years later, and they charge admission to the guided tour. The next place that operated this way was not 300 years ago. It was not in colonial Massachusetts. It was more recent than that, and closer than you think. And if you want to know where the machinery went after Salem, if you want to follow the institutional logic forward through the centuries to where it landed, that story is here. It is waiting. Salem remembers what it did. What Salem cannot tell you is whether the thing it built has ever been fully dismantled.